The moment my husband chose his mother over me, I stopped hearing the rest of what he was saying. Ryan was standing across the kitchen island on an ordinary Thursday evening when my world shifted in a direction I never expected. Dinner dishes were still on the counter. Our daughter Emma was upstairs finishing homework. The television hummed softly in the family room. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. Until Ryan calmly said, "Mom is moving in with us next month." At first, I thought I misunderstood him. "What?" I asked. He did not hesitate. "Mom is moving in." The certainty in his voice made my stomach tighten. Not because of the idea itself. Because of the way he said it. Not as a discussion. Not as a question. Not as something we would decide together. It sounded like a completed decision. Something that had already happened. I stared at him for several seconds, waiting for the rest of the conversation to appear. It never did. "Moving in," I repeated. "What do you mean moving in?" Ryan leaned against the counter and folded his arms. "She is selling her house." "Okay. And she will be staying here." I waited. Surely there was more. Surely he planned to explain why this had never come up before. Surely he understood that inviting another person into our home permanently was not a minor adjustment. Yet he simply looked at me as though the matter was obvious. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. Ryan frowned. "I am telling you now." The answer landed like a stone. 12 years of marriage. 12 years of building a life together. 12 years of making decisions as a team. Yet somehow one of the biggest changes our family would ever experience had already been decided before I entered the conversation. "You are serious?" I asked quietly. "Sarah, she is my mother." That is not what I asked. The room fell silent. Ryan looked away first. That was when I knew there was more to the story. He was hiding something. Maybe not something terrible, but something important. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. His hesitation lasted only a second. A single second. Long enough. "A few months." My heart dropped. "A few months." Ryan immediately started explaining. Something about timing. Something about not wanting to worry me. Something about waiting until plans became final. I heard every word. None of it made sense. If anything, each explanation made the situation worse. By the end of the conversation, I felt less like a wife and more like the last person informed about a family decision everyone else already knew. Later that evening, I sat at the dining room table pretending to answer emails while Ryan watched a baseball game in the next room. My laptop screen glowed in front of me. I did not type a single word. Instead, I replayed the conversation again and again. Eleanor and I had never been especially close. We were polite, friendly even, but we were very different people. She liked giving advice whether people asked for it or not. She believed traditions should never change. She had strong opinions about parenting, money, schedules, and nearly everything else. The thought of sharing a house indefinitely made me uneasy. What bothered me most, however, was not Eleanor. It was Ryan. He had already chosen a side before the conversation started. Around 9 o'clock, Emma came downstairs for a glass of water. She stopped when she saw me sitting alone. "You okay, Mom?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Of course." Emma nodded. Then she said something that made my entire body go still. "Grandma will be happy when she finally moves in." I looked up sharply. "What did you say?" Emma shrugged. "Dad told me a while ago." A while ago. Those 3 words echoed inside my head. Ryan knew. Eleanor knew. And apparently Emma knew too. I watched my daughter walk back upstairs while a cold realization settled over me. Everyone seemed to know what was happening except me. And for the first time since Ryan announced the move, I began wondering whether the real problem was not that Eleanor was coming. The real problem was why everyone worked so hard to keep it from me. The next morning, I woke up hoping the previous evening had somehow been exaggerated by exhaustion. Maybe Ryan had spoken too quickly. Maybe there were details I did not understand. Maybe this entire situation would feel more reasonable in daylight. Unfortunately, reality looked exactly the same at 7 o'clock in the morning. Ryan was already in the kitchen making coffee when I walked downstairs. He smiled and asked if I wanted breakfast. The casualness of it all nearly made me laugh. It was amazing how normal he seemed after dropping a life-changing announcement into our marriage. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "How long has your mother known?" I asked. Ryan sighed immediately. "Sarah, how long?" He stared into his coffee mug. "About 3 months." 3 months. The answer settled heavily between us. 3 months of phone calls. 3 months of planning. 3 months of discussions. and somehow I had been excluded from every single one. And Emma? I asked. Why did Emma know? Ryan looked uncomfortable. She overheard a conversation. I nodded slowly. I did not believe him. Not completely. The explanation felt too convenient. Yet I let it go for the moment. There were bigger questions. Why is your mother selling her house? I asked. Ryan hesitated. She just wants a change. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Eleanor Mitchell had lived in that house for nearly 40 years. She planted every tree in the backyard herself. She knew every neighbor on the street. She still baked cookies for the elementary school fundraiser every December. People do not suddenly wake up one morning and abandon a life like that because they want to change. You do not actually believe that, I said quietly. Ryan rubbed his forehead. Sarah, it is complicated. There it was again. Another vague answer. Another closed door. By lunchtime, I had stopped expecting straightforward explanations. The following weekend, Ryan announced that Eleanor would be coming over to discuss moving arrangements. The words discuss moving arrangements irritated me immediately because the arrangement itself had apparently already been decided. Saturday afternoon arrived cold and windy. Around 2 o'clock, Eleanor's car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the front window as she stepped out carrying a folder and a large handbag. She looked exactly as she always did. Well, dressed, confident, organized. The kind of woman who never seemed surprised by anything. She entered the house with a warm smile and immediately hugged Ryan and Emma. Then she turned toward me. Hello, Sarah. Hello, Eleanor. Polite, civil, careful. We gathered around the dining room table. Eleanor opened her folder and began discussing practical details. Storage space, furniture, moving dates, utility transfers. Listening to her felt surreal. Everyone spoke as though the move were already happening because, apparently, it was. My opinions seemed completely unnecessary. At one point, Ryan and Emma stepped into the kitchen to answer a phone call from a relative. For the first time all afternoon, Eleanor and I were alone. Silence settled across the room. She looked down at the papers in front of her before speaking. You are upset. It was not a question. Should I not be? I replied. Eleanor studied me carefully. You have every right to be. The answer caught me off guard. I expected defensiveness. I expected excuses. Instead, she sounded almost regretful. Then why did nobody tell me? I asked quietly. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Guilt. Sadness. Maybe both. Because some conversations are harder than people expect. It was not an answer. Not really. Yet her expression told me she understood the damage that had already been done. Before I could ask anything else, Ryan returned. The moment disappeared. A few hours later, after Eleanor left, I began clearing empty coffee cups from the dining room table. That was when I noticed something unusual. One of the folders she brought had been left behind beneath a chair. I picked it up, intending to place it aside for Ryan. Then a small photograph slipped out and landed face up on the floor. I froze. The picture showed Eleanor standing beside a man I had never seen before. Both looked serious. Neither was smiling. Across the bottom, written in black ink, were 5 words that instantly made my pulse quicken. Meeting with attorney Michael Grant. I stared at the photograph in confusion. Because suddenly, this no longer looked like a simple move. It looked like preparation for something much bigger. I stood in the dining room staring at the photograph long after everyone else had gone upstairs. The image itself was ordinary. Eleanor stood beside a man in a dark suit outside an office building. Yet nothing about it felt ordinary. Meeting with attorney Michael Grant. The words echoed through my mind. Why would a simple move require meetings with attorneys? Why would someone take a photograph of such a meeting in the first place? And why had Eleanor looked so serious in the picture? I slipped the photograph back into the folder and placed everything exactly where I found it. By now, I had learned that every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. The following week passed quickly. Work remained busy. Emma had school activities nearly every evening. Ryan spent most of his free time helping his mother prepare for the move. Boxes began appearing in our garage. Furniture measurements were discussed over dinner. Dates were finalized. Meanwhile, I felt increasingly disconnected from decisions affecting my own home. The strangest part was that nobody appeared intentionally cruel. Ryan genuinely believed he was helping his mother. Eleanor remained polite and considerate. Yet somehow I still felt like an outsider observing a plan that had been unfolding long before I entered the conversation. One Wednesday afternoon, I arrived home unexpectedly early after a client meeting was canceled. The house was quiet. Emma was still at school. Ryan was at work. I assumed I was alone until I heard voices coming from the backyard patio. Curious, I walked toward the sliding glass door. Eleanor was sitting outside. Across from her sat the same man from the photograph, Michael Grant. Even from inside the house, I recognized him immediately. They appeared deep in conversation. Several folders rested on the table between them. I froze. Part of me knew I should walk away. Another part had spent weeks being excluded from important conversations. I remained where I was. Through the glass, I could not hear every word. Only fragments carried by the wind. Trust, documentation, timing, protection, future arrangements. The terms sounded legal, serious, yet they still revealed very little. After several minutes, Michael stood and shook Eleanor's hand. Then he left through the side gate leading toward the driveway. I stepped away from the window before either of them noticed me watching. A few moments later, Eleanor entered through the kitchen carrying her folders. She looked surprised to find me home. "You are back early," she said. "Meeting got canceled," I replied. For a second, I considered asking about the attorney. The question sat on the tip of my tongue. Yet something stopped me. Maybe it was the exhaustion of constantly searching for answers. Maybe it was the realization that direct questions rarely produced direct responses. Either way, I remained silent. That evening, however, another unexpected piece of information surfaced. Ryan and I were folding laundry while Emma finished a science project upstairs. The atmosphere felt calmer than it had in days. Then Ryan casually mentioned that he would be taking Friday off work. "Why?" I asked. "Mom has another appointment." My hand stopped moving. "Appointment?" Ryan immediately looked as though he wished he had chosen a different word. "Just some paperwork." There it was again. The hesitation. The careful editing of information. "With the attorney?" I asked. Ryan stared at me. "How do you know about Michael?" The fact that he used the attorney's first name told me everything. This was not some recent professional contact. Ryan knew him well. Much too well. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ryan sat down on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. He suddenly looked tired. Not frustrated. Not defensive. Just tired. "Sarah, there are things happening that Mom is not ready to talk about." "Things like what?" I asked. Ryan rubbed his eyes. "Things she is trying to protect us from." The sentence lingered in the air. Protect us. Not protect herself. Protect us. Before I could ask another question, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He looked at the screen and immediately stood up. The expression on his face changed so quickly that it made my stomach tighten. Concern. Genuine concern. He answered the call and listened silently for several seconds. Then he looked toward me. "That was Mom," he said quietly. "Something happened this afternoon." I stared at him. "What happened?" Ryan swallowed hard. "The attorney found something she thought was gone forever." Ryan's words followed me for the rest of the evening. The attorney found something she thought was gone forever. It sounded important. More important than anything I had heard so far. Yet when I asked for details, Ryan simply shook his head. It is not my story to tell. Under normal circumstances, that answer would have frustrated me. This time it did something different. It made me curious. The next morning, Ryan left early to meet Eleanor before her appointment. Emma went to school. I drove to work, but my concentration lasted less than an hour. My mind kept returning to the same question. What could someone lose for years and then suddenly recover through an attorney? Property records? Financial documents? A will? None of the possibilities seemed large enough to explain the tension I kept seeing in both Ryan and Eleanor. That evening, when I arrived home, I immediately sensed something had changed. Ryan's truck was already in the driveway. Eleanor's car sat beside it. Through the front window, I could see both of them sitting at the dining room table. Neither appeared to be talking. They simply sat there quietly, waiting. The moment I walked through the door, both looked up. Eleanor's eyes were red, not from recent tears, more like someone who had spent an entire day revisiting painful memories. "Everything okay?" I asked carefully. Ryan stood and offered a small smile. "Sit down." Those two words rarely lead anywhere simple. I placed my purse on a chair and joined them at the table. A large envelope rested in front of Eleanor, the kind attorneys use when carrying important documents. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Eleanor took a slow breath. "There are things about your father-in-law that I never told many people." I immediately sat back. This was the first time she had voluntarily opened a door instead of closing one. After he passed away, she continued, I thought I had gathered every important document in our house. Her fingers rested lightly on the envelope. Apparently, I was wrong. She opened it carefully and removed several aged papers. Some looked decades old. Others appeared newer. One item immediately caught my attention. It was a letter, handwritten, folded neatly, protected inside a clear sleeve. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment before speaking again. Michael found this hidden inside an old safety deposit inventory that was never properly cataloged. Ryan remained silent. I could tell he already knew the story. What is it? I asked. Eleanor looked at me. A letter from my husband. The room became completely still. When was it written? I asked. Almost 20 years ago. I frowned. That made no sense. If the letter was that old, why was it only being discovered now? Eleanor seemed to anticipate the question. We thought it was lost. Her voice softened. For nearly 2 decades, I believed it had disappeared forever. She carefully unfolded the letter but did not hand it to me. Instead, she read a short section aloud. The words themselves were private, personal, full of love and concern for his family. Yet one sentence stood out immediately. It mentioned protecting something for the future, something he hoped would help his family one day. Eleanor lowered the page. At the time, I never understood what he meant. And now? I asked. She exchanged a glance with Ryan. Now we think we do. My confusion deepened. Ryan finally spoke. The attorney discovered records connected to the letter. He paused. Records nobody knew still existed. Financial records, property records, trust documents. My mind raced through possibilities. Yet before I could ask another question, Eleanor slid a small photograph across the table. I picked it up carefully. The image showed a younger version of my father-in-law standing beside a building I did not recognize. Written on the back was a date from more than 20 years earlier and a single sentence. If anything ever happens to me, make sure Sarah knows the truth. I stared at the words in disbelief. My name. My name was written on the back of a photograph that existed decades before I even met Ryan. Slowly, I looked up at Eleanor. Her expression revealed the same shock she had likely experienced when the attorney first showed her the discovery. And in that moment, I realized this mystery was no longer about why Eleanor was moving into our home. Somehow, impossibly, it had become connected to me. I barely slept that night. The photograph sat in my mind long after I turned off the bedroom light. If anything ever happens to me, make sure Sarah knows the truth. The sentence made no sense. I did not meet Ryan until college. His father passed away years after we married. There was no possible way my father-in-law could have written my name on a photograph more than 20 years earlier. Yet I had seen it with my own eyes. The next morning, I found Eleanor sitting alone at the kitchen table. A cup of tea rested beside her. The envelope from the attorney sat unopened nearby. She looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. Like someone who had spent an entire day revisiting memories she had tried to leave behind. I sat across from her. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since the night before. How could my name be on that photograph? Eleanor wrapped both hands around her teacup. Because it was not your name originally. I stared at her. What? She reached into the envelope and carefully removed another document. This time it was a copy of an old handwritten note attached to the photograph. The original writing had faded with age, but several sections remained readable. Michael Grant had apparently commissioned a restoration specialist to recover portions of the text. Eleanor slid the copy toward me. Your father-in-law never wrote Sarah. My eyes moved across the page. The original word had been damaged. Nearly impossible to read. What remained visible looked closer to a different name entirely. A family name. A placeholder. A reference to a future member of the family. Eleanor gave a small sad smile. We think he meant whoever eventually became Ryan's wife. I blinked several times. Suddenly, the mystery shifted again. The message had not been directed specifically to me. It had been directed to someone he hoped would one day join. The family. Someone he trusted without ever meeting. The thought felt strangely emotional. Why? I asked softly. Eleanor looked toward the living room, where framed family photographs covered a bookshelf. Because he was worried. About what? For a moment, she hesitated. Then she answered. About me. The response caught me completely off guard. You? She nodded slowly. Your father-in-law knew me better than anyone. He knew I was independent. He knew I hated asking for help. A humorless smile crossed her face. He also knew I would eventually become lonely. The room fell silent. I thought about everything that had happened during the past month. The move, the secrecy, the attorney, the missing documents. Suddenly, it all felt connected by a thread I had not seen before. Eleanor continued speaking. When he became ill, he worried about what would happen after he was gone. Her voice softened. Not financially, emotionally. I listened quietly. He used to tell me that people prepare for retirement, but almost never prepare for loneliness. The sentence landed heavily. Because deep down, I knew she was right. Eleanor looked down at her hands. I thought I was stronger than that. For the first time since I met her, I heard genuine regret in her voice. Not regret about moving in. Regret about waiting so long to admit she needed people. The attorney found more than the photograph, she continued. He found records connected to a trust your father-in-law created. My attention immediately sharpened. Trust. Another word I had heard repeatedly during the past few weeks. Eleanor opened a folder and revealed several pages. Most of it was designed to support future family members if they ever faced difficult circumstances. She pointed toward one section. But there was also a letter explaining his wishes. I looked at the page carefully. The document appeared legitimate, thorough, thoughtful, very much the sort of thing a responsible husband and father would create. Yet one sentence stood out more than anything else. Family should never face life's hardest years alone. I read it twice, then a third time. Suddenly, I understood why Eleanor looked so emotional. This was not really about money. It was not even about the trust itself. It was about a promise. A promise made decades earlier by a husband who understood his wife better than anyone else. Before I could say anything, the front door opened. Ryan walked inside carrying another folder from the attorney's office. His expression was serious. He looked from me to Eleanor before speaking. Michael called this morning. Eleanor immediately straightened. What happened? Ryan placed the folder on the table. They found the final file. The room instantly became silent. Because whatever answers we had uncovered so far, it was obvious the biggest one was still waiting to be opened. Ryan placed the folder on the kitchen table as though it contained something fragile. For several seconds, none of us moved. The atmosphere felt different from every other conversation we had shared during the past month. The frustration and tension that once filled the room had been replaced by anticipation. Whatever was inside that file had the power to explain why Eleanor had spent months working with an attorney and why Ryan had guarded so many details. Eleanor slowly reached for the folder. Her hands trembled slightly. It was the first time I had ever seen her nervous. She opened it carefully and removed a thick stack of documents secured by a binder clip. The first page appeared to be a legal summary prepared by Michael Grant's office. Eleanor skimmed several paragraphs before pausing. Her eyes widened. Then she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. I cannot believe this, she whispered. Ryan leaned forward. What is it? Eleanor handed him the document. While he read, I watched both of them carefully. Ryan's expression changed almost immediately. Surprise gave way to disbelief. Then disbelief slowly transformed into understanding. Finally, he passed the papers to me. According to the summary, the attorney had discovered a second trust created by my father-in-law shortly before his death. Unlike the first trust, this one had never been activated because several supporting documents had been misplaced during a bank merger years earlier. The records were only recovered after Michael requested a comprehensive historical search connected to the recently discovered letter. I continued reading. The trust itself was not enormous. It was meaningful, but not life-changing. What mattered was the accompanying explanation. My father-in-law had written detailed instructions describing why the trust existed. Every page reflected the same concern. Not finances, not property, family. He believed strongly that future generations would face challenges no amount of money could solve alone. He worried that pride would keep people from asking for help. He worried that grief would isolate people. Most of all, he worried that Eleanor would one day convince herself she had to carry every burden without support. I looked up slowly. Eleanor's eyes glistened with emotion. He knew me too well, she said softly. Ryan smiled sadly. He always did. We spent the next hour reading through the remaining documents together. The further we read, the clearer the picture became. My father-in-law had not been trying to leave behind wealth. He had been trying to leave behind guidance. Nearly every letter emphasized communication, honesty, and family connection. One page contained a section addressed specifically to Ryan. Another focused on future grandchildren. Then we reached the final letter. Unlike the others, it was addressed simply to whoever needed it most. Eleanor handed it to me. "Read it," she said. The handwriting was slightly uneven, but still clear. The message was remarkably simple. It spoke about seasons of life, about how strong people sometimes become isolated because everyone assumes they are fine, about how families often misunderstand each other when fear replaces conversation. Near the bottom, one sentence immediately captured my attention. The person asking for help is rarely the weakest person in the room. I read it twice, then a third time. Suddenly, the entire situation looked different. For weeks, I had focused on Ryan's decision. I had focused on being excluded. I had focused on feeling hurt. Those feelings were real. But now I could also see something else. Eleanor had not spent months plotting to move into our home. She had spent months struggling to admit she needed family. The realization hit me harder than I expected. Late that evening, after Emma returned from a friend's house and everyone else went to bed, I remained alone at the kitchen table reading the letters again. The house was silent. Outside, a cold autumn wind moved through the trees. Eventually, I heard footsteps behind me. Eleanor entered wearing a robe and carrying a cup of tea. She sat across from me. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, she smiled. "You know what the funny part is?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. Her smile grew slightly. "All these years, I thought I was protecting everyone else." She looked down at the letters. "I never realized they were trying to protect me too." The words settled gently between us. For the first time since this journey began, there were no secrets left inside folders. No hidden meetings. No missing explanations. Yet as I looked at Eleanor sitting across from me, I realized there was still one conversation we had not fully had. Not about the trust. Not about the letters. Not even about the move. There was still the question that started everything. Why Ryan chose to stand beside his mother before he ever spoke to me. And the next day, I finally decided to ask him. The next afternoon, I found Ryan in the garage organizing tools he had promised to sort nearly a year earlier. The large workbench was covered with half-finished projects, old paint cans, and storage bins labeled in handwriting only he could understand. Under normal circumstances, I might have laughed. Instead, I stood in the doorway with my arms folded and waited for him to notice me. When he finally looked up, he immediately recognized the expression on my face. "Oh," he said lightly. "That bad?" I smiled despite myself. "We need to talk." Ryan set down the screwdriver he was holding and nodded. A few minutes later, we sat together on the back porch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. Emma was at volleyball practice. Eleanor had gone to meet a friend for coffee. For the first time in weeks, there were no interruptions. No attorneys. No documents. No mysteries waiting inside folders. Just the two of us. "I understand your mother better now," I began. Ryan listened quietly. "I understand why she was scared. I understand why she struggled to ask for help." He nodded. "Good. But there is still something I do not understand." His expression became more serious. "What?" I looked directly at him. "Why did you decide everything before talking to me?" The question hung between us. Ryan leaned back in his chair and stared toward the trees at the edge of the property. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he sighed heavily. "Because I was afraid you would say no." The honesty surprised me. Not because it was shocking, because it was so simple. "You really thought I would refuse to help your mother?" I asked. Ryan rubbed his hands together. "No, not exactly." He paused. "I thought you would want time to think about it." "Of course I would. And I thought if you had time to think about it, Mom would change her mind before we reached a decision." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan looked down. The first time she asked for help, she almost took it back before she finished the sentence. Suddenly, I remembered every story Eleanor had told us about independence. Every comment about not wanting to burden anyone. Every moment, she minimized her own needs. Ryan continued. "She spent months convincing herself she could handle everything alone." His voice softened. When she finally admitted she was struggling, I panicked. I listened quietly. I knew if I told her we needed family discussions and planning meetings, she would disappear before any of it happened. The explanation was imperfect. It did not erase the hurt. But for the first time, I could see the fear driving his decisions. Ryan had not chosen his mother because he valued her more than me. He had chosen urgency over process, emotion over communication, protection over partnership. The results still hurt, but the intention looked different now. You should have trusted me, I said quietly. Ryan nodded immediately. I know. There was no defensiveness. No excuses. Just regret. I handled it badly. We sat in silence for a while. Then Ryan smiled faintly. For what it is worth, Mom yelled at me too. I laughed. She did. The day after she moved in. His smile widened. She said I should have talked to you first. That information genuinely surprised me. Seriously? Ryan nodded. She was furious when she realized how I handled it. The image of Eleanor scolding her 42-year-old son was strangely comforting. For weeks, I had imagined the two of them operating as a team while I stood outside the circle. Now I realized the reality had been much messier, much more human. Later that evening, the four of us ate dinner together. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody delivered emotional speeches. Nobody made grand declarations. Emma talked about school. Ryan discussed work. Eleanor shared a story about one of her friends getting lost in a shopping mall parking lot for nearly an hour. We laughed more than we had in weeks. At one point, I looked around the table and noticed something unexpected. The tension that once seemed impossible to overcome was gone. Not because every problem had been solved, because the truth had finally replaced assumptions. After dinner, while helping clear the dishes, Eleanor touched my arm gently. Thank you, she said. For what? She smiled. For giving me a chance to explain. I looked toward the dining room where Ryan and Emma were still talking. Then I looked back at her. Thank you for finally letting us help. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply smiled. And standing there in the kitchen, I realized the question that had haunted me from the beginning no longer mattered as much as I once thought. Because the story was never really about someone choosing one person over another. It was about what happens when fear keeps a family from talking until they finally find the courage to listen. Over the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm none of us could have predicted when this journey began. Eleanor officially moved into the guest suite at the far end of the house. This time, however, everything felt different. The move was no longer something happening to me. It was something we were doing together. We spent an entire Saturday organizing her belongings. Emma helped label storage boxes. Ryan assembled shelves in the garage. I worked alongside Eleanor sorting photographs, books, and decades of memories collected throughout her life. At one point, we opened a box filled with old family albums. Hours disappeared as stories emerged from every page. Eleanor pointed out relatives I had never met. Childhood photographs of Ryan covered entire sections. Some pictures made us laugh. Others made us unexpectedly emotional. For the first time, I was not looking at Eleanor as my mother-in-law. I was looking at her as a person with an entire history that existed long before she became part of my life. One afternoon, while organizing another stack of papers, I found myself rereading portions of my father-in-law's letters. The words affected me differently now. In the beginning, I focused on the mystery surrounding them. Now I focused on the wisdom inside them. Family should never face life's hardest years alone. The sentence remained simple. Yet the more I thought about it, the more profound it seemed. So many of our problems had not been created by bad intentions. They had been created by silence. Ryan stayed silent because he was afraid. Eleanor stayed silent because she was proud. I stayed silent because I was hurt. Each of us believed we were protecting something important. Instead, we accidentally created distance. The realization stayed with me. One evening, Eleanor and I sat together on the back porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and gold above the trees. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. Can I tell you something embarrassing? She asked. I smiled. Of course. Eleanor laughed softly. The first week I moved in, I was convinced you hated me. I nearly choked on my lemonade. You thought I hated you? She nodded. Absolutely. We both started laughing. The irony was impossible to ignore. During that same week, I had been convinced she was deliberately taking over my home. Two women sitting under the same roof. Both afraid. Both making assumptions. Neither actually talking. When the laughter faded, Eleanor became thoughtful. Your father-in-law used to say that people hear fear louder than facts. I considered the statement carefully. It explained far more than either of us wanted to admit. The next month brought another positive development. Eleanor received encouraging news from her doctors. Additional evaluations showed stability. Continued monitoring would still be necessary, but the uncertainty that once dominated her thoughts no longer felt quite so overwhelming. Ryan looked visibly relieved. Emma celebrated by baking cookies. Eleanor cried when she thought nobody was watching. This time, however, she did not carry those emotions alone. We carried them together. As winter approached, family dinners became routine again. Holiday decorations appeared throughout the house. New traditions slowly blended with old ones. Not every day was perfect. We still disagreed occasionally. Eleanor still offered unsolicited advice. I still needed personal space from time to time. Ryan still tried to fix problems before fully discussing them. Yet something fundamental had changed. We no longer assumed the worst about one another. We asked questions. We listened. We explained. One snowy evening in early December, I found myself standing in the kitchen watching Eleanor and Emma decorate cookies while Ryan untangled Christmas lights in the living room. The scene looked ordinary, completely ordinary, yet it filled me with a feeling I could not quite describe. Peace, perhaps. Gratitude. Maybe both. Because months earlier, I had believed this situation would divide our family. Instead, it had forced us to become more honest than we had ever been before. As I watched the people I loved laughing together, I realized I had spent most of this story asking the wrong question. I kept asking why my husband made the choice he did. Eventually, I learned a better question. What was everyone so afraid of losing? The answer, I finally understood, was each other. And once that fear was spoken aloud, everything else began to change. Christmas morning arrived with 6 inches of fresh snow covering the neighborhood. The world outside looked calm and untouched, the kind of winter scene people place on holiday greeting cards. Inside our house, however, the day began with laughter, the smell of cinnamon rolls, and Emma racing downstairs before anyone else was fully awake. I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee when Eleanor appeared wearing a red sweater she claimed was older than Ryan's college degree. A few months earlier, I would have worried about sharing every holiday tradition with another adult in the house. Instead, I found myself smiling. Somewhere along the way, the arrangement I once feared had become normal. More than normal, it had become meaningful. Later that afternoon, after gifts had been opened and breakfast dishes had been cleared away, Eleanor disappeared briefly into her room. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box. The same box I had seen sitting quietly on a shelf several times, but never questioned. She walked into the living room and sat beside the Christmas tree. Ryan immediately recognized it. "Mom," he said softly. Eleanor nodded. "I think it is time." Emma looked curious. I sat down beside Ryan as Eleanor carefully opened the lid. Inside were photographs, letters, and a few keepsakes collected over decades. Items connected to my father-in-law. Family memories. Pieces of history. Eleanor picked up one photograph and smiled. "Your grandfather carried this picture everywhere." Emma leaned closer. Ryan laughed when he saw the image. "I remember that one." For the next hour, stories filled the room. Stories about first jobs, family vacations, mistakes, successes, difficult years, wonderful years. Some made us laugh. Others brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Yet every story carried the same message. Family mattered. Connection mattered. Showing up for people mattered. At one point, Eleanor removed the final letter from the box. The same letter that had quietly changed all of our lives. She handed it to Emma. "Keep this safe someday," she said. Emma looked surprised. "Me?" Eleanor smiled. "You are part of the story now, too." I watched the exchange quietly. Months earlier, I would have focused on the documents, the secrets, and the unanswered questions. Now I saw something else entirely. Legacy. Not financial legacy. Emotional legacy. The values people leave behind long after they are gone. As evening approached, snow continued falling outside. The house glowed with warm light. Christmas music played softly from the living room. Ryan eventually sat beside me on the couch. "You know," he said quietly, "I never expected any of this." I laughed. Neither did I. For a moment, we simply watched Emma and Eleanor working on a puzzle together at the dining room table. Then Ryan looked at me. "I am sorry for how everything started." The apology arrived months after the original mistake. Yet somehow, it arrived at exactly the right time. I squeezed his hand. "I know." And I did know. Not because what happened was acceptable. Not because it did not hurt. But because understanding had replaced anger. We had all made mistakes. We had all acted from fear. The difference was that we finally admitted it. As the evening came to an end, I stepped outside onto the back porch alone. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the darkness. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. I thought back to the woman I had been when this journey started. Hurt, defensive, convinced that someone had taken my place. Looking back now, I realized something important. Nobody had taken my place. Nobody had been chosen over me. What I witnessed was a family struggling to navigate fear, grief, pride, and love all at the same time. It was messy, imperfect, human. The truth I spent months searching for was far simpler than I ever imagined. Ryan did not choose his mother because he loved me less. He chose quickly because he was afraid of losing her. Eleanor did not move in because she wanted control. She moved in because she finally admitted she could not carry everything alone. And I did not fight so hard because I was selfish. I fought because I wanted to feel included in the family I helped build. Standing there beneath the falling snow, I realized all three of us had been asking for the same thing in different ways. To be seen, to be heard, to belong. Inside the house, laughter echoed through the windows. I turned back toward the light and warmth waiting for me. Then I opened the door and stepped inside, finally understanding that family is not defined by who gets chosen. Family is defined by who stays when life becomes difficult and who finds the courage to open the door when someone they love needs a place to come home.